Since 1991, India has walked a tightrope between liberalisation and welfare. How do you think this is playing out at present and in the future?
It remains a tightrope and should. These will always be in tension. As Mahbub al-Haq put it, we need growth because you can't redistribute poverty. So any efforts at redistribution require increased resources in order to redistribute.
What does this contest between the US and China mean for players like India?
It's a new opportunity, but I would say that people have to look at that really in a clear-eyed way and see the implications of it. In Sri Lanka, that's meant a port that has essentially been turned over to China. They come with the costs of failure.
Hello and welcome to Business Standard. I'm Ankur Bhardwaj, and today's special conversation, we travel across history, borders, and big ideas to understand how the global South, especially South Asia, helps shape the world we live in today. Our guest today is David C. Engerman, historian and professor at Yale University, whose work explores the Cold War, development economics, and the politics of aid. His new book, Apostles of Development, Six Economists and the World They Made, published by Penguin Random House in India, follows six extraordinary South Asian economists: Amartya Sen, Manmohan Singh, Jagdish Bhagwati, Mahbub ul-Haq, Rahman Subhan, and Lal Jayawardena, who didn't just respond to the challenges of decolonization, poverty, and inequality, but helped build the global institutions and ideas that define development even today. In this interview, we explore three broad themes. First, the making of the book and the stories behind the apostles. Second, the enduring contest between market liberalism and welfarism, especially in India and across the developing world. And third, how the current US-China economic rivalry compares to the Cold War and what it means for countries like India. We'll also ask, did each country in the Indian subcontinent imagine development differently? And how do these visions continue to shape their political and economic choices today? Let's get started. Professor Engerman, welcome to Business Standard.
Welcome. Nice to be here.
So let's begin how you arrived at this book. What led you to this project and what led you to these six figures?
I was interested and have long been interested in writing histories of international development that don't turn the so-called recipient nations of the global South into pure vessels upon which others act, whether the US or the Soviet Union. It's a theme I explored in my last book, The Price of Aid, which showed how American and Soviet ideas, resources, and individuals were put to work by Indian policymakers rather than the other way around. And so I was interested to do that. To ask what a history of international development would look like if it was told from the perspective of the global South. And I experimented with a few different ways of doing this, but on the advice and after some conversations with my colleague and fellow Yale historian Rohit Dey, realized one of the best ways to get at it was to look at these six economists who all studied together at Cambridge in the mid-1950s and went on to incredibly long and illustrious careers. And those are the six I ended up with. So the purpose was to try and recount a history of international development, a history of development economics that didn't start in Washington or in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Cambridge, England, or London, but instead started in this case, across South Asia.
Well, in this book, you also push against this idea that development is a Western export. Can you walk us through as to how these six figures, flipped this narrative?
Well, I think that the tendency, and this may be especially true of works published in the United States and Europe, the tendency has been to see development as a kind of Cold War project about winning friends and influencing people in the global South. And there's no doubt that in a way it was. But what that loses is the fact that the real motive force in international development were people in poor countries trying to make themselves and their countries less poor. And that, I think, is a kind of fundamental dynamic that we often lose track of. And this happens from the Western tendencies are visible, not just from those who celebrate American and Western aid, but even from those who criticize it. They tend to see it all as a kind of reimposition of Western empire and so on and so forth. So I wanted to see what that looked like from the global South and from South Asia in particular.
Well, some of these apostles went on to work in global institutions. Do you think their ideals ever clashed with their roles in these global institutions?
I think it varied. I mean, the six are quite different in every way, the six so-called apostles. And all of them were engaged in global institutions, and they brought different things to them. Some, I think, magnified tendencies that were out there. Some brought in new voices. In the cases of the two scholars in the group, Amartya Sen and Jagdish Bhagwati, their contributions came in large part through their publications. But in any case, they all brought this imperative, really, to try and reduce poverty and inequality in the global South. That's what they brought to the question, not the kind of questions of Cold War alignment. They were interested in solving this economic and social problem.
And out of all these six, when you were researching, was there a figure that really surprised you?
I think in different ways, each of them surprised me. I found reading Jagdish Bhagwati's early work in international economics just fascinating, because by the time I ran across him, he'd become more of a polemicist around globalization, but to see the kind of quality and impact that his work had had. Mahbub al-Haq, I think what surprised me about him was a trip to Lahore that I made in 2019. And in the West, Haq has a reputation as a liberal, right? Helping push the World Bank to the left with basic human needs, inventing the Human Development Index and so on. But these young scholars I met in Pakistan excoriated Haq, connecting mostly to his work with Pakistani dictators in the 60s and the 80s, Ayub Khan and especially Zia ul-Haq, and were highly critical. And it shouldn't have surprised me, but nevertheless it did.
Well, these six individuals came from 4 different countries: India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. And each of these countries also took a different path since independence. How do you think they shaped these paths, and what led to these countries choosing the paths that they did?
I think in each case they're different. They're facing different circumstances. One of the key arguments of the book is that development economics and development programs emerge not out of theoretical conclusions, but out of practical efforts to solve problems. And each of them were trying to solve different problems. In Bangladesh, or East Pakistan, actually, the question was about inequality between West Pakistan and East Pakistan, which is something that Rehman Sobhan engaged effectively over the course of the 1960s, to the point of helping write the 6 Points Manifesto and then serving in Bangladesh's Planning Commission. Sri Lanka had been a commodity exporter in a large scale, especially tea, coconut, and rubber. And so they were facing a different sort of problem than India faced. Obviously, the one who had the most immediate and direct impact on policy, I think is safe to say, is Dr. Manmohan Singh for his role in 1991 in leading the sort of major economic reforms there. And then, of course, his decade as prime minister.
Do you think these early differences in how these countries charted their paths still affects how they engage with the global economy now?
Well, I'm a historian, so I believe that the past shapes the present. And so all of them do. I think all of them have been through changes, right? I don't think we should look at the single Sri Lankan economic policy that's been steady since 1948, and similarly for Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. India's change was the most dramatic, from abandoning a kind of state-centered and state-regulated economy up through 1991 to dispensing with significant portions of that effort in really just the summer of 1991. So they've all changed. I think Bangladesh, especially in its early years, and when Sobhan and his mentor Nurul Islam were in the Planning Commission there, had a real radical vision for what Bangladesh, independent Bangladesh, would look like, and that never did come to pass. So each of them have each country has different problems and circumstances, and each of the individuals take different attitudes to it.
We are aware of the contrast between Amartya Sen's vision of welfare economics and what we've seen, Dr. Manmohan Singh's reform-oriented approach. Do you think Manmohan Singh tried to bridge this gap between the two? Or do you think that he took India in a completely different direction?
I think he took it in quite a different direction, but I think it's possible to overstate the differences between Sen and Bhagwati. And to some degree, they help us with that because I think they both, especially Bhagwati, tended to overstate their differences. One of the things that struck me the most is reading Amartya Sen's work in the mid-1990s. And he applauded Dr. Singh and the Narasimha Rao government for, as he put it, getting the state out of places it shouldn't be in, and then at the same time, called on the Indian state to go deeper into the areas where it should be involved in, particularly health and education. And so that shows that we're not talking about a kind of extreme growth orientation, kind of anti-inequality orientation, but something that saw both in context. Bhagwati, as early as 1960, is criticizing the Indian state for underinvesting in primary education. So there are points in common there that get lost in their public disputes.
Well, since 1991, India has walked a tightrope between liberalization and welfare. How do you think this playing out at present and in the future?
I mean, I'm a historian, so I don't have to speak professionally to the present. I guess I would say that I think it remains a tightrope, and should. These will always be in tension. How to invest in the future while also ensuring better conditions for those in the present. I think that's a fundamental question. It's actually ultimately a political and not an economic question. In fact, the Cambridge professor who was most influential for each of them, Joan Robinson, said that the question of how to balance the interests of the current generation against future generations is not an economic question. No equation, no statistical procedures, however sophisticated, can solve that political question. I take that to be an accurate statement.
Around the world, we're seeing a renewed talk about basic income, safety nets. Are we circling back to the same ideas that these apostles debated decades ago?
Yes, I think the questions that they set out are pretty fundamental questions, and they're still working it out. And I think it will change at each moment. They change over changed circumstances. I think those who are in favor of kind of strong emphasis on welfare, nevertheless, need to and usually do support some degree of growth. As Mahbub al-Haq put it, we need growth because you can't redistribute poverty. So any efforts at redistribution require increased resources in order to redistribute.
Unlike in the West, where education and healthcare are part of the welfare state, in India we tend to have more targeted schemes for welfare. Does that mean that the difference between markets and welfare is more manageable in a place like India?
I mean, I think India has problems in terms of extremes of poverty and, at least until recent years, extremes of wealth, although now the US is doing its best to catch up and surpass. I think they face different problems. There's fundamentally a kind of strong basis of public education in the United States. Our medical system, however, and public health system, I think, is inconsistent at best and actually downright invisible or unavailable to certain parts of our population. Our population is smaller by a factor of almost 4. So it faces different problems. I do think that some of the welfare efforts that emerged in Dr. Singh's prime ministership, some of which had his firm support, others of which I think came closer to just acquiescing to, have made a tremendous difference. And Rega, I think, being probably the biggest one of all.
In your earlier work, you have looked at how the Cold War shaped the Indian economy. If you look at the current US-China rivalry, what feels similar to you, and what do you think has changed?
I think that even before the Trump presidency, in terms of what's changed from before, even before the Trump presidency, the aid programs were more transactional. I think during the Cold War, one of its defining elements is an ideological conflict, and so it's seeking to persuade those in the global South to take one side or the other. I think there's less. It's a lot more transactional now than it was in the Cold War. I think China has not had tremendous success in India, although certainly being in Sri Lanka, as I was last week, you can see the impact of Chinese loans, Chinese development efforts there.
Do you think economic nationalism in the form of trade wars, tariff wars, and stuff like that, do you think that is the language of global power now?
Certainly, that's the American language of global power in the immediate moment. I think at some point we'll have to see where these tariffs end up. It's a lot of bluster at this point. There's actually a line that really, from a journalist, that really gets under the president's skin, called TACO, TACO, right, referring to the Mexican food, standing for Trump always chickens out. That he starts with a big threat and then quickly unravels, reduces it. So it's hard to see where things will settle in the next year. I think what he says, his program flies in the face of every respectable economist in the United States. That tariffs are the way to shape the United States economic relationship with the world. But he doesn't seem bothered by that, and his administration has found a few people who take that position, and so they've moved in that direction. But even the most conservative U.S. economists, as well as the most liberal, see international trade as a net benefit to both sides.
Now, we cannot avoid a question about Donald Trump. So I have to ask you about Donald Trump's legacy in this development space, because in your previous works, you've written about how the US used development aid, particularly through institutions like the USAID, as a kind of a tool for diplomacy. The Donald Trump administration does not seem to see that. How do you think the definition of development has changed for the US in that way?
Well, I think before I get to the specific question about Trump, I think development has changed dramatically from what it was in the 60s and 70s that I've been writing about, where then it was much more about specific projects, bringing in expertise. Now, I mean, none of the South Asian countries I look at in this book, none of them are considered developing countries. They're all lower middle income countries on the World Bank charts. I think they all have much more sophisticated financial instruments. And so development has become development finance much more than it had been. I see this when I work with Yale students who are getting public policy degrees, most of whom have firsthand experience in the development sector, but most of them are doing it through regional development banks, through private sector banks, green development. So I think there's been a larger shift toward development finance over the last 20 years. So I think having some changes to how the USAID would interact with the world would have been inevitable to keep up with that. I don't think that said that these are the changes to make. There'd been long a debate whether USAID should be folded into the State Department. So the idea that it becomes part of the State Department isn't inherently problematic to me. The idea that it rejects the possibility of development as a tool of diplomacy is just a profound mistake and a misreading of the work that USAID and its predecessors have done.
Do you think it looks at development aid as just purely as a strategic tool and not just as a moral imperative?
Well, the challenge is it doesn't seem to look at it as anything, right? It doesn't even it rejects the notion of development as a strategic tool for the most part. I do think the moral imperative was always tied, in its justification, was always tied to kind of either a political or a moral claim. A political claim during the Cold War, this is the way to win friends in the third world, as well as a moral claim about how small sums of money and small interventions can lead to much longer and healthier lives in the poorest countries.
And do you think this retreat by the United States opens the door for other players, for example, China, multilateral institutions, or even private capital, who can walk into this space and even define as to what development really means?
Well, that's a great question following on what I said about development finance. I think it could. I think the loss of USAID, if permanent, will inhibit the possibilities of this. I think a lot of the times private capital does go in, but they go in following not formal assurances in most cases, but following the lead of development professionals. So if you look at the Development Finance Corporation, which is in spite of its name, is a public-private entity in the United States, that they calculate, if I have the numbers right, that that for every $1 million they loan or invest for equity purposes in the development project in the global south, that I think it's somewhere between $5 and $10 million from private capital come in. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the role of the U.S. bilateral agencies in facilitating private capital. As for the multilaterals, it's a little too soon to tell, but of course the World Bank is dominated, as it always has been, by the United States. And so it depends how assertive the Trump administration wants to be in that score to restrict the kinds of work that the World Bank has been doing.
And do you think in this era of a retreating Washington, D.C. and an expanding China, is non-alignment still relevant for a player like India? Or do you think we are in this era of strategic balancing where everyone is aligning with everyone and therefore no one? So,
yeah, I don't know. I have and this I think informed by Swapna Naidu's new book on Nehru's foreign policy, see non-alignment is actually a fairly complex and sophisticated strategy, not just a sort of moral claim against the dividing the world in blocks, but one that gave a fair amount of strategic maneuverability to Indian diplomats. I think China is less interested in the kind of formal alignment parts of how the economic Cold War operated. And the United States had been interested in those, but perhaps were in a more transactional moment with those as well. But of course, the rise of China as a development player dates back even before the first Trump administration, really not too long after the turn of the century.
Especially in places like Africa.
Especially in Africa. Pakistan is another place where it's been very controversial, but plenty of supply. Sri Lanka as well. So it's close to India, if not in India. I was just talking with some former diplomats yesterday who are concerned about China making inroads into Bangladesh, which they have not thus far done, as a kind of area of future concern.
My next question would be, what does this contest between the US and China mean for players like India? Does it move them to the margins, or do they become the center of the contest? Is this a new opportunity that they probably be getting?
It's a new opportunity, but I would say that people have to look at that really in a clear-eyed way and see the implications of it. In Sri Lanka, that's meant a port that's essentially been turned over to China. They come with the costs of failure in the Belt and Road Initiative have been much higher. On the other hand, capital is capital. It's ultimately fungible, whether it comes in through China or the United States or multilaterals as well. The other thing I just want to note here, while I think what's going on in the United States is particularly destructive, catastrophic even, that over the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen a decline in development assistance from across Europe as well. The United Kingdom folded its development agency, DFID, into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They've reduced their bilateral spending. They're using more development aid for refugee settlement in the British Isles themselves. The Dutch, among others, have been reducing government aid. So we're looking at a move away from the highest stages of development. In any case, even before USAID was attacked by the Trump administration.
Well, we live in the moment of climate disruption, rising inequality, and digital divides. Do you think the ideas that your apostles talked about are still relevant for us?
I do think that they are. I think that most of them were concerned with a different set of problems that were facing them. And by the time environment became a central concern, I guess starting in the early 70s, but really by the 90s, Conference on Sustainable Development, et cetera, these apostles that was not at the forefront of their concern. So I think this in some sense is new. I do think that new for them. I do think that it's consistent, particularly in Amartya Sen and Mahbub al-Haq's work about forms of and dimensions of inequality.
If the Global South were to rewrite the book for development, what would it look like?
If the Global South itself would rewrite the book on development, not mine, you mean, but someone really from the Global South, Well, I hope it would have some echoes with mine, but I think it would probably take more seriously than this book does, a kind of grassroots development efforts. Jean Drèze plays a small role in this book, but I think Drèze or Runa Roy, the dozens, if not hundreds, of NGOs operating in India, hundreds, if not thousands, really, operating in India or across South Asia, show a very different approach to development. I think these gentlemen were of a generation which development was implicitly, if not explicitly, a kind of top-down phenomenon. And so I think if a global South history would actually look from below on the global South at a kind of deeper, more deeply into non-state-centered global development than this book does.
Looking ahead, do you see any other movements which are picking the threads that your apostles weaved earlier?
That's a good question. Let me think about that for a second. I mean, I think in their writings, which are voluminous, would fill up certainly the shelves of this room, they were particularly driven by the question of inequality, but also the political challenge of fighting inequality. Fighting inequality is in some sense zero-sum, that the way you do it is by redistribution, either redistribution of future assets and income streams or redistribution of present ones. Neither of those have been politically feasible in most of South Asia for most of the period of independence. So I think to the extent that there are questions of political economy, those remain relevant today, although now operating in this new sphere, for instance, of climate justice in a way that they hadn't been in the era that these apostles were at their prime.
It's been many decades since these apostles went to Cambridge, and their ideas have been around in the world for a long time and in the countries and implemented. What is the balance sheet looking like on their ideas at this point in time?
I mean, I think they were an impressive and truly original group of scholars. I think some of them did more in generating ideas and some did more in applying ideas. So I think Amartya Sen and Jagdish Bhagwati were the ones who really had an impact on their fields of professional economics, welfare economics in Sen's case, international economics in Bhagwati's. I think some of the questions raised in Bhagwati's earlier work amount to understanding the political economy of international trade, which I think is an issue that's very much still with us. If we think of the kind of populist turn, across the world, with versions of it in South Asia as well as in the United States, that reminds us the importance of political economy in who wins and loses from trade. So those ideas are very much around. Focus on inequality, both horizontal, like regional inequality, which I think climate justice addresses, is something that Sobhan devoted much of his career to. And then human development, the extent that the purpose of development is not simply to increase GDP per capita, but a successful case of development is not a GDP increase, but lives better lived. And that between Sen and Huck, I think both share credit in bringing that into a kind of...
As Huck said, what good is GDP to a girl who doesn't live till she's 5? Exactly.
So I do think those ideas are still relevant today. I don't think they're all forgotten, but I do think we could always use a little reminder about them.
Professor Engerman, thank you so much for your time and speaking to Business Standard. It was a lovely conversation.
Thank you, Ankur.
That was David C. Engerman, historian, storyteller, and a chronicler of lives behind the economic choices that still echo in our world. From Delhi to Dhaka, Colombo to Washington, the story of development has never been linear. It's been shaped by ideas, institutions, and individuals who dared to ask what justice, equity, and freedom could look like beyond GDP. I am Ankur Bhardwaj, and thank you for joining us. For more such conversations, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, keep questioning.
Want access to Business Standard's premium insights? Join our exclusive LinkedIn communities and connect with top voices in the BFSI space on topics that matter to you.